Hi, hello, chess lovers, and welcome back to Chess Way. Today, we've got an absolutely wild game to break down, a clash between Alexander Alekhine and Roland Duncan. This game was played on October 6th, 1922, and trust me, this thing goes off. All right, the game begins with the English opening, pawn to c4. Black responds with e6, then comes knight to c3, pawn to d5, and white declines the offer with d4. Black develops the knight to f6, and instantly white applies pressure with bishop to g5. After knight b to d7, Alekhine finally captures the pawn on d5. Black takes back, but careful, that pawn on d5 is a poison pawn. Let me give you a quick reference line here. If the knight captures that pawn, yes, it's pinned, but the knight is still bold enough to take the other knight. And if bishop takes queen, then comes bishop to b4, check. The king cannot move, so queen must block. And after a crazy sequence where pieces get traded, black simply ends up with an extra knight early in the game. All right, hopefully that helps for your future positions. Back to the game. White ignores the pawn and plays pawn to e3, opening the bishop's diagonal and giving the king a square. Now the knight is ready to take the pawn on d5. So black plays pawn to c6 to defend. Development continues, knight to f3, bishop to e7 preparing castling. White plays bishop to d3, Roland castles, and Alekhine castles as well. Middle game time. Black starts with rook to e8, and I always remind you, this weakens the f7 pawn. Alekhine plays rook to e1. Not bad, but it lets the knight maneuver to f8, clearing the way for the bishop. He's clearly aiming for the center. Pawn advances to e4, challenge. Black accepts, knight recaptures, and the knight jumps to d5, hitting the bishop. Alekhine accepts the exchange, black takes back, and look at this! Black's knight sits strongly on an outpost. Center belongs to the knights now, and black feels great. Knight flies to f4, pressuring the bishop. The bishop is too good to give up, so white saves it to c2. Then knight from d7 goes to e6, hitting the pawn twice. Knight back to f3 is possible, but Alekhine chooses queen to g4. The threat is knight to f6 check, king moves, takes h7. So Roland retreats the knight to d5 to cover f6. White continues, queen to h5. Bishop and queen team up on h7. Since f6 is covered, pawn to h6 is very logical. But if the queen stays on h5, black cannot feel safe. Maybe that's why he plays rook to e8, inviting a queen trade. Looks normal. But this is actually a blunder. Can you see Alekhine's insane combination here? Yes, queen captures pawn on h7, check, a full queen sacrifice. In the actual game, the king goes to f8, but let's see what happens if king captures. Now knight leaps to f6, double check. Wherever the king moves, white takes the pawn on f7, not check, but checkmate. Absolutely brutal. Back to the game. King must go to f8. Not queen to h8, instead queen drops to h5, threatening checkmate on f7. This is not a simple threat. If pawn to g6, queen swings to h7 and it's over. Rook can't block, it's checkmate. So the queen must defend, landing on c7. But here comes knight to d6. If queen takes, it's checkmate. And since nothing defends the pawn anymore, Roland pushes pawn to g6. Queen goes to h8, king is forced to e7, queen takes rook, check. Two options, but king captures the knight. Knight jumps to c4, checkmate incoming. So king goes to f6. Queen shifts to g8, and look at this, check is coming. If king goes to e7, queen takes pawn on f7, king goes to d8, queen goes to e8, checkmate. Roland tries knight to g7, but white plays knight to e8, check again. Knight takes knight, and instead of recapturing, queen goes to h8, check. Final analysis here.
If the knight blocks, then the knight will be sacrificed again on g4 check. If bishop capture the knight, queen to h4 check, forcing pawn to block, and queen to h6, checkmate. Or try the other option, where the king can only go to g5, followed by queen to h6 check, forcing the king to capture the knight and checkmate with either the f-pawn or the h-pawn. Again, this is very brutal and very cool, my friends. All right, let's return to the game. So, blocking with the knight will end in checkmate. But if the king goes to the e-file, of course, the checkmate is quicker because the rook and queen can cooperate. So this time the king goes to g5. All right, this is not much different from before. Even more exciting, pawn to h4 check, forcing king to f4, and then pawn to g3 delivers checkmate. Very unique, right? Earlier we analyzed that the f-pawn and h-pawn could deliver checkmate, but in the real continuation, it is the g-pawn that delivers the checkmate. This is more exciting because the process comes from a combination of two pawns. Indeed, when Alekhine attacks, he doesn't do it halfway. Very exciting game this time. All right, friends, that's it for this video. I hope it was entertaining and useful. And if there were any mistakes in my words, I apologize. Greetings, chess lovers. Thank you.